Hi, welcome to World Civilizations until 1500. This is History 2321. Now, we're initiating the very first topic of the semester titled Out of Africa, from the origins of humanity and early humans to the rise of civilizations. So this is session one of the very first topic, once again, out of Africa, from the origins of humanity and early humans to the rise of civilizations. And what we're going to be doing in this topic is really looking at Africa primarily, but in the context of the origins of human beings, when human beings really appeared on the planet, according to the archaeological record, meaning that as far as what we have found, scientists, the fossils of early humans, everything points out that human beings very early on appeared on this continent, which is really, again, we're going to be talking about this continent geographically. Is a vast continent, by the way. Now, Africa, of course, is going to be significant throughout the course, not just because it was the home of human beings, the cradle of humanity, but also along the way, we will continue to revisit Africa for various reasons, and that is that it was also the home of great civilizations such as Egypt, for example. So this topic is going to be devoted to Africa, primarily because of the origins of human beings and so on, and how we're going to see human beings migrating out of Africa into different parts of the globe, of course. But as I said, eventually we will return to Africa from time to time, whether to look at civilizations such as Egypt, but also looking at the interaction of other civilizations in Africa, such as, for example, the Assyrians of Mesopotamia. They're going to be moving into Africa. We're going to be looking at the Roman Empire, for example, colonizing parts of North Africa. And, of course, when we talk about later on the rise of Islam, we are going to see Islamic territorial expansion into different parts of North and East Africa as well. So we will be looking at Africa throughout the course, but I wanted to devote really just a whole topic looking at Africa in this context that we're about to begin. So let's now turn our attention to the outline. And as I explained, there is going to be an outline for every topic. You will see the title on the very top, as you can see here. And we're going to first look at the table of contents, what we're going to be covering regarding Out of Africa, from the origins of humanity and early human societies to the rise of civilizations. Now, the table of contents show that the way we are going to approach this topic is by looking at three main parts. And each session, remember there's going to be 3 sessions per topic, will be devoted to each one of those parts. So for session 1, we're going to look at the origins of humanity. Okay. In session 2, we're going to look at early human societies. That is to say, this is the time when human beings are now coming together and forming the very first groupings or settlements, if you will, and trying to create a society, a community. In other words, this is prior to the rise of civilizations. In other words, before there were any civilizations on the face of the planet, which means cities. Once again, something I already explained in the class introduction. Again, civilizations entail, of course, people living in cities. Before that time, human beings started to really form societies thousands of years before the very first civilizations appeared. And we're going to be looking at that in part 2. very closely, what kind of very early societies existed, what kind of social structures, political structures, what kind of religious beliefs and practices were common across the world. And then part 3, which is going to be session 3 of this topic, is going to look at the rise of civilizations itself. What we're going to be doing in part 3 is just really looking at the major key concepts or analytical points of civilizations. In other words, trying to define what is a civilization, what were the major features of a civilization that were common around the world. Of course, there are differences between different civilizations, of course, as you will notice across the semester. But there are certain commonalities, certain shared principles, if you will, or ideas that are characteristic of civilization, and also looking at one of the major themes, again, that we're going to be looking at across the semester. Meaning that as we're going to be exploring different civilizations like Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, China, Mesoamerica, Greece, Rome, etc., we are going to be paying attention to certain major themes along the way, and this is going to really help you identify how we're going to be studying civilizations in this course. So it's going to be critical. Part 3, it is going to be very, very critical for you to actually examine very closely, because this is going to give you a guide of how to actually go about studying civilizations, again, in world history. All right. So now let's turn our attention to part 1, the origins of humanity. All right, so before we begin part 1, let me first offer a general introduction to this topic. We're going to cover a vast amount of material regarding the origins of the universe, the origins of humanity, early humans, and the like. And again, we're really going back in time before the rise of civilizations. And so I want to explain why, in other words, looking at prehistory, first and foremost, why are we looking at prehistorical times? Prehistorical times means the time before there were any written records. That is what prehistory means. Before human beings develop writing, language, before human beings actually develop a script by which to actually record their memories, their thoughts, their ideas, and of course, the succession of past events, what we call history, recording the past, if you will. That is prehistory. Civilizations, which flourished, roughly speaking, about 4000 BC, this is the very first, the very early, time of the flourishing of civilizations, if you will, in the Middle East. There were human societies around the world, but those human societies had not yet developed a system of writing. That is to say, they used, of course, art forms like painting and pottery. Of course, they did that. But it was not really a system of writing that could be read in a way that could describe, for example, events that happened in the past. So it is difficult to reconstruct, so to speak, the history that occurred prior to the rise of civilizations, in this time of prehistory, in other words. Nonetheless, the reason why we do have to look at prehistory, despite the fact that there are limited resources available for us to read what happened actually prior to 4000 BC, let us just say, is because, despite the fact that there's a limitation for that, uh, our knowledge of prehistory serves really as the foundation for civilizations, that is to say. In other words, civilizations, the rise of cities, in other words, people began to create a new setting, a new social setting called a city, living together and trying to create an orderly life with laws and trade and religious beliefs and practices and so on. What we call civilization, life in the city. Civilizations does not just begin 4,000 BC, in a vacuum. Those cities that began to arise around that time took the knowledge, the experience, the ideas that have been accumulated over thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of years. And they use that prior knowledge to start building something new, something larger, something more complex, such as a city, in other words. Okay? So one of the reasons why we're going to be exploring prehistory starting in this session and in the next is because this is going to help us understand how civilizations were built, what kind of ideas human beings formulated, developed over time, prior to this time, that served as the basis, as the foundation for city life, if you will. Okay? So we're really looking at baby steps or stepping stones, if you will, that humans were taking over the course of time until finally they reached the point of creating something really, really complex, in other words. Okay, so this is one of the reasons why we're going to look at prehistory. Now, I mentioned that the sources were limited. It is true. Even when the very first civilizations flourished in the ancient world, the sources that are left to us to actually understand what kind of societies, what kind of political systems, what kind of economic systems, and so on, they created in the very early rise of civilizations. Yet they're very, very limited as well, despite the fact that they had writing and so on, writing systems. Again, the lapse of time, over thousands of years, what has happened is that many of those writings have disintegrated, deteriorated, if you will, and we do have, of course, certain sources available to us, but it's not really that rich. Even less when we talk about prehistory, early human societies. So how then, if we are actually studying very ancient civilizations such as Egypt, for example, or Sumerian civilization in Mesopotamia, or the Indus River Valley in northwestern India, how then are we supposed to actually reconstruct what kind of societies, political systems, religions, and so on, religions, they actually created? Well, the only sources, so to speak, that are available to us in the present moment to actually take a glance and trying to actually see more or less what those civilizations were like, or even the time of prehistory, so to speak, is based on what is called, number one, archaeology. Okay? Archaeology. The archaeological record. So what is the archaeological record? The archaeological record is really just the remnants, the remains of, let's say, buildings, architectural constructions, buildings, for example, fossils that they have left, fossils of animals that they farm or that they hunted, for example. What kind of tools were used to actually hunt or kill those animals is going to tell us in what stage those human beings were, depending on how sophisticated the tools were, for example. The fossils of human beings as well tells us a lot about what kind of diet, for example, they had, or what were the causes of death, generally speaking, in a city. Whether we're talking about epidemics, for example, whether we're talking about malnutrition, whether we're talking about degenerative diseases, for example, crime, natural catastrophes that occurred in certain moments of that city history. And of course, the kind of diet, because by examining, of course, the dental remnants, if you will, of those human beings, of those fossils, it can tell us a lot about what kind of diet, whether it was a protein-rich diet, or carbohydrate or sugar-rich diet, and so on and so forth. Again, so archaeology, first and foremost, is very, very valuable because we are indeed just taking whatever was left from human beings, from the animals that they farmed or hunted, and even also from the structures that they created as well, whether we're talking about tools, whether we're talking about buildings or temples, their cities, their residences, what kind of homes they built, what kind of material they used, etc. It tells us, again, at least, again, something about those societies. Archaeology. Another very, very important source of information, of historical record that is available to us, is mythology. How do we go about studying, for example, ancient Egyptian beliefs and practices? How, for example, the ancient Egyptians conceived the universe, how they saw the world around them, what kind of forces, what kind of beings were in control of the universe that were important to them, and so on. What was really the meaning of life and death? What happened to the human being when the human being died, and so on. Whether we're talking about the ancient Egyptians or the ancient Maya or the ancient Toltec, for example, or Olmec, or the ancient Greeks, and so on. Mythology provides a very, very valuable source of religious and also scientific and also psychological information. Okay? Religious, scientific, and psychological. What do we mean about that? Well, when we look at, for example, the paintings in the murals, and the ancient Egyptian temples, for example, that continue. Again, we can still see them today. There are museums you can visit. There are books you can read in which you're going to see, of course, the murals, the paintings of the Egyptians praying to certain gods that were governing their universe, that were important in their daily existence, and that were in control of all of the forces of nature, including life and death. So you can see that those paintings are mythic stories, if you will. It's like a book, if you will, that has symbols. Those are religious symbols that tells us about what kind of spiritual, religious worldview they formulated. Whether, once again, we can be talking about the ancient Egyptians or the Maya. Likewise, there are murals, there are inscriptions, actually, set in stone that the Maya left on stone pillars, for example, that depict their gods. It depicts their major gods and their ancestors and their kings interacting with those gods, and it tells us something about the relationship between the human world and the spiritual world, for example. This is how they actually conceived the universe. So once again, mythology, which is really the study of symbols, which in this case we're talking about religious, symbols, religious stories that are set in stone or painted on murals or on tombs or pyramids. They're inscribed in rocks that are left in certain, monuments and so on. Those are actually stories that can be decoded for us to understand the kind of universe that those societies actually conceived of. This is the way they saw the universe, in other words. Okay, so it's a very, very important historical source. I mentioned science as well. Mythology provides also a glance into the scientific worldview as well, not only the religious, but in many cases those mythological images or inscriptions, those symbols that are left by those societies in the ancient world, can also tell us about how human beings tried to understand the universe around them. How they try to explain, for example, scientifically, why, the sun, for example, and the moon intersect to produce an eclipse. What is their meaning? What happens during the eclipse according to them? Okay, there are certain scientific ideas on the rise very early on with the rise of civilizations, some of which were very naturalistic. Naturalistic means that they were trying to create a natural science, the science of nature, and trying to explain things like rain or earthquakes, and they're trying to explain things like eclipses and so on, and trying to provide an explanation of what is really happening in nature, in the world of nature. Whether there's a divinity or a god or a spirit interacting during that event, again, is also part of the equation, but nonetheless, what we see is a scientific system that was communicated also through mythic stories as well. Okay? Mythology. Now, I also mentioned that mythology provides also a glance into the psychology, again, of ancient peoples as well. Very often, more often than not, myths also convey certain ideas about morality, for example, or ethics. There's a search among human beings to create some form of moral code. How are we supposed to behave in this world? What is proper behavior? What is good behavior? What is bad behavior? And so on. Psychologists now propose that since time immemorial, human beings have experienced for example, the feeling or the emotion of guilt every time, for example, human beings engage in something called murder, for example, which was very common in the ancient world and even in prehistoric times. And so the way that human beings try to grapple with that feeling of guilt after committing murder, again, led people to search for a moral code. In other words, that maybe there is a law beyond human beings, a law that is really part of the cosmos or the universe, is part of what the gods or God, had established for human beings to follow, for example. And so many of the myths that are left to us by ancient civilizations are also trying to provide a moral code. In other words, that, human beings are trying to be good, and they're searching for goodness, if you will, for virtue, what is called virtue. This is an impeccable, if you will, state where humans actually act in accordance to some form of divine law, okay, that does not actually destroy or harm, if you will, others. And they used to communicate their ideas about morality and ethics, what is right, what is wrong, often through myths. And of course, many of the mythic symbols that are left to us inscribed in temples and so on are also psychological readings in terms of, this is what a civilization, for example, the Egyptians, believe about goodness. They stress the idea of justice, compassion, and goodness in human beings' lives because they really believe that this is the way that human societies in general are sustained over time. When there's goodness, if you will, you can sustain a society, you can sustain, of course, a group of people when there's a certain moral code that everybody follows. And of course, there's a reward, after death, the idea of going into a heavenly or celestial realm to enjoy a paradise and so on. That's pretty much the reward, again, of acting in accordance to the laws of goodness, if you will. So, mythology is extremely important because it reveals to us religious ideas, scientific ideas, but also the state of mind, if you will, the psychological composition of a society in terms of how they behaved, what kind of guidance, what kind of codes or ethics they conceived of in order to sustain their societies, trying to create some form of balance or harmony among human beings. Now, many of those myths have survived the test of time through oral tradition, meaning that despite the fact that many of those myths were inscribed thousands of years ago in those religious temples and so on, well, yes, it's true, but the population that lived in those cities, for some reason or another, were able to preserve parts or aspects of those legends or stories and transmitted those stories and legends or so-called myths from generation to generation through what is called oral tradition. The father will, raise their children and instruct them into the ideas of the culture. It's called oral tradition. You pass on the code of ethics, the morality, through those stories. You tell a story and there's always, a hero, for example, there's a villain, and the hero is always, the representation, the embodiment of goodness, in other words. And we should, imitate and follow them, their example, and so on. Okay? And this is another way we can actually tap into an ancient civilization by really recovering the ongoing surviving myths of today. If you want to know what the ancient Maya used to think about, the world around them, or the gods, or life and death, right and wrong. Well, one way is to go into the Maya area, whether it's Yucatan or Central America, visit the elders and try to pretty much, talk to them and try to recover, their so-called mythologies, their stories, because in their stories there's really, again, a code that will enable us to understand the religious, scientific, and psychological, system of the ancient Maya. Okay, the same goes for the Native Americans of North America. You can visit a reservation, recover the ongoing mythologies, and you can pretty much unveil, if you will, also the societies, the Native American societies that lived in this region for hundreds and hundreds of years, and so on. You can go case by case. So mythology is a very, very important resource. Another resource is linguistics. And that is that it is really through the study of linguistics, the language, in other words, whether we're talking about formal, established languages or dialects, if you will, that we're able to trace the origins of certain groups. How do we know, for example, in Europe, that most of the different ethnicities of Europe share a common background, for example? Well, right now, we can use genetics, that's true, to determine that, of course. But before the advent of genetics, what anthropologists and archaeologists and historians did was to use linguistics and look at commonalities between different languages, despite the fact that, German, for example, language and the Dutch language are different and the English language are different. They do share, a common origin. Those are part of the so-called Germanic languages. The Belgium, of course, it's also part of the Germanic languages, the Scandinavian languages and so on. But more than that, there are, of course, a multiplicity of many different languages across Europe. We have the Slavic language of the Russians. We have, of course, the Latin of the ancient Romans that survived today in the Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese language, Romanian language, and so on. All of those languages, including the Germanic languages, are tied together by yet another common root that we're going to be talking about later on. Of course, is called, Sanskrit. Sanskrit was really the mother root language of all the European languages, despite of their differences and so on. So again, linguistics enable us to really trace the origins of certain groups back in time by really looking at the structure, the words, the similarities, and how certain languages are offshoots of others, so you can actually create like a family tree, in other words, and you can trace the history of an entire people and their migrations as well by looking at the trails of those languages across time and space. So those are the sources. Okay, when we study world civilizations, particularly in the ancient world, or we're talking about prehistory, those are the sources. There are very few written records. Once again, because many of those records have been destroyed over time due to erosion, or just they have disappeared from catastrophes and so on of nature. So those are actually what historians that study world history, world civilizations, particularly the civilizations that we're going to be looking at, this is what they actually use. Now, last but not least, what then, if we're starting with Africa, what is the significance of Africa for world civilizations? As I explained in the beginning of this video, the significance of Africa is that, first and foremost, this is where the continent that actually saw the birth of humanity. Early humans, if you will. And even today, the contemporary modern, what is called homo sapien, okay, the human species that of course inhabits the planet today, we all go back to human ancestors that came out of Africa at different points in time, whether we're talking about 100,000 years ago or 60,000 years ago, or even later. Okay. So modern Homo sapiens actually have all of their roots and descendants from Africa. And we're not just talking about, the modern human being comes from Africa, this is the significance, but rather that in Africa, humans were crafting the very first tools, as we'll see, and they were crafting the very first political, religious, and even social structures that are going to be exported out of Africa across the planet, and they're going to take different expressions, very distinct, very different expressions that over time they're going to flourish into civilizations. So the very, very seed ideas of all the civilizations that we're going to be looking at, again, came from Africa as well. This is why we're starting with Africa in this topic. Okay. Now, let's start with a very fascinating portion of our topic here. Part 1 is going to look at the origins of humanity. And in order to do that, I would like to take some time to actually go back, as far back as to look at the origin of the universe. Okay? Very briefly. Again, this is not going to be an exhaustive analysis of scientific theories and so on, but we do have to look at what we have found out or know so far about the origin of everything. That is to say, let alone just the origins of human beings, but we're talking about the origin of the universe at large. Now, of course, since the rise of civilizations, there's been so many theories. Every civilization have formulated different ideas about how the world started. And of course, in the ancient world all the way to the very early modern world, the prevailing idea is that, well, the universe was created out of a divine act. In other words, there's a God or series of God and spirits and forces that are creating the universe and they govern it, in other words. Okay? And again, that was the prevailing idea up to the time of the early modern period. Let us just say up to 1500. Okay? 1500, that is really the dividing line between the early modern period and the modern period. The modern period begins, roughly speaking, around 1500. Okay, centuries before 1500, you see again the early modern period. So, with the early modern period and the modern period, the era that we inhabit today, what we're going to see is a shift away from religious constructions, religious explanations as to why the universe started, and we're going to see a more naturalistic science, the rise of modern natural science, in other words, in which scientists are now trying to explain the origin of everything, the origin of the universe by looking at a more physical, materialistic lens, using a more physical, materialistic lens to actually provide some form of explanation. And of course, we have, of course, the rise of new scientific theories that said, well, the universe is made up of matter. It really, functions as a machine. And maybe was created by a divine being, but, we don't know. Okay, there is that big, question, we don't know. That was the idea. But the scientists that are moving forward with this new conception of the universe are strictly trying to understand the world materially, that is to say. So the underlying assumption for centuries, let us just say from the 1600s all the way to, let's say, the 1910s, thereabouts, is that, well, yeah, the universe is just a physical machine. However, in the early 20th century, starting around the 1910s and 1920s, we're going to see a scientific revolution underway with the advent of relativity theory proposed by Albert Einstein and, of course, quantum theory as well. Quantum theory, for example, introduced the notion, not just the notion or idea, but rather the discovery of the atom, that really matter is really not solid, but rather is just made up of energy. In other words, that the universe is really just light or energy, that is to say. Okay, that is quantum physics was born. Relativity theory was a theory that looked at a more universal, if you will, explanation about the origin of the universe and where the universe is going, in other words. Okay, it also agreed with the idea, the discovery that the universe was energy as well. So with new scientific discoveries, we're going to see new technologies like telescopes, for example. And through the use of telescopes in the 1920s, scientists were able to uncover something that was totally unknown for, literally since the beginning of time, if you will, for human beings on Earth. And that is that the universe had a beginning, in other words. Okay, this universe that is really made up of energy had an actual beginning, as opposed to, well, the universe have always been, here, it has always existed, it's just an eternal creation or entity, if you will, that has always been here. That was the assumption. But now that scientists are coming to terms with the world of energy and are now formulating or creating, super telescopes that can look even outside our own galaxy, they discovered that there were many other galaxies surrounding our own, something that was unknown as well. We thought that the Milky Way was the only, universe, the galaxy that surrounds us. But we discovered that this was just one of so many galaxies. And what this telescope, the Hubble telescope, was able to detect is that many stars and galaxies are actually moving away from us. In other words, as if there's like a ripple effect and that the universe is actually expanding. And if that is the case, then that means that it is expanding out of a moment in which the universe actually existed in a point, in a tiny, tiny point of light, if you will. So there were no stars, there were no time and space of any kind. There was no creation. It was just one point of light, and that point of light exploded into existence. It was a massive explosion of energy out of this point, and it's very difficult to grasp, but that point was not just a point located somewhere. It was called really infinity. That point expanded at all directions at once. Okay, so no time and space. It was just, again, you want to call it nothingness? All right. There's so many terms we can use. But at some point, the universe created this explosion of energy. Out of nothing comes, of course, light. You know, the first atoms and this explosion of massive energy. And this explosion still continues to expand across the universe, in other words. So this is called the Big Bang Theory, in other words. And according to calculations, mathematical calculations, scientists propose that this occurred somewhere around 13.7 billion years ago from the Earth perspective of time. So when we're talking about years, those are Earth years, by the way. Okay, every time we measure time, every time scientists come up with a theory about how old is a galaxy or a sun, etc., or a black hole, those are actually time constructions from the Earth sphere, if you will, from our own Earth, our own concept of time. Okay, so according to our own concept of time, of what a year entails, this happened about 13.7 billion years ago. Okay, the whole universe was created. At some point, that energy began to condense and become more and more consolidated, so to speak, forming the first suns and planets and the like. The very first structures, if you will, the galaxies are going to be created again in this process that took literally billions of years to form, billions and billions of years to form. Okay, eventually the solar system was formed. There was a planet called Earth, and this planet started out as a hot planet, meaning that the conditions were not ripe for life because the temperature of the planet was so elevated that we're not going to see any life form whatsoever. There was absolutely nothing alive, in other words. It was a mineral, actually, planet, a mineral state, if you will. At some point, this planet cooled off. We see the waters becoming more calm. It was becoming more stable, energy-wise, the planet. And at some point, the planet reached the moment, the time when it was ready to house life, in other words. And this gave us the very first transformative event in the origins of humanity, that is to say. But there were no humans, of course. This very first transformative event was an event in which, according to scientists, in the waters, mainly in the ocean, for example, what we're going to see is the very first cell life appearing on the oceans. How this came about? Well, there's a lot of explanations, of course. Charles Darwin, the biologist of the 19th century, believed there was, a lightning that struck the ocean, and the electricity of the lightning, along with the chemicals that were present, created those cells. More recent scientific theories propose that there was stardust coming from outer space, and that star does carry some form of life, living organisms, cells, or bacteria. And when they reach the planet and fell on the water, we see again a number of different living organisms in the planet. Okay, so how this process came about, it is not known. Again, there are theories, once again, that try to describe, they're trying to explain how this process happened. Okay, this was considered a biological Big Bang. This was not the birth of the universe through the very first atoms and energy that sprung into existence out of nothing, but rather it was really the very first living organisms, that appeared suddenly in the waters of the earth. Okay, those entities, those little simple cells, they're just simple cells that appeared around the world, were called the eukaryotes. Again, this is the scientific term. Once again, how this process came about in the earth, is still a mystery, if you will. But what scientists propose, particularly evolutionary scientists, is that this marked the origin of life in the world and the origins of species. What that means is that, according to scientific theory, those simple cells that were in the water evolved. And how they evolved is that they started dividing, creating a replica of itself, and then mating, and then out of that interaction, the mating of two cells, this is going to produce yet a third organism that is going to become more complex. And so this process gets repeated over and over again. Again, the divisions of cells, and then the mating, and then the offspring becoming more and more complex over time, adapting to different conditions, environmental conditions, and of course that accelerates the process of mutation and evolution. So that gives us, of course, everything that is alive, from plants, algae, fungi, parasites, amoebas, in the waters, that became the fish, different kinds of fish. Some of them actually stepped out into the world. The reptiles, so to speak, they adapted to live in the land, out of the water. And we see, of course, the rise of the reptiles, the dinosaurs, for example. And out of the dinosaurs, after millions of years of adaptation and mutation into different forms, we see the rise of the mammals. So the rise of the mammals occurred, roughly speaking, about 60 million years ago. Okay, 60 million years ago. The dinosaurs existed prior to that time for millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, by the way. So we're talking about a time span that is astronomical. I mean, this process of mutation and adaptation, and the birth of different species that came from the water. I mean, this is something that occurred over, according to scientific theory, again, over the span of hundreds of millions of years ago. And that is not until really about 60 million years ago that the first mammals appeared on the planet. Evolving out of the dinosaurs, they mutated and they became different, more complex, and they're called the mammals, all the mammals, if you will. And of course, this is according to the theory where human beings actually come from, is that somehow, those mammals became so complex that gave us, of course, the modern human being. Once again, this is a theory. This is what scientists propose based on their study of fossils, the study of DNA, genetics, and so on. And this is how they're trying to understand the past. Again, it's just a theory, by the way. It is a theory. And theories get revised, they get corrected, they get reworked all the time. As new knowledge comes in and we know more about the world and so on, again, we're beginning to make modifications along the way, of course. Even revise an entire theory altogether. All right, so now humanoids are going to appear on Earth, particularly in Africa. Okay, in the continent of Africa, we're going to see the very first humanoids. And what we mean about humanoids in this case is that we're going to look at the very first human like creatures that are very similar to the modern Homo sapien, the modern human being, in many respects. So that's why it's called a humanoid. It's not really called human because it's human like. And they began to appear in the continent of Africa, roughly speaking, we're talking about 7 million years ago or thereabouts. About 7 million years ago, we have some evidence, mainly fossils. Remember, we're looking at fossils, remnants, remains, bones, skulls, again, tools that were left by very early human beings, or early humanoids in this case. That is going to tell us more or less what kind of humanoids appeared on the face of the earth. Remember, we're talking about Africa. This is the birthplace again of humanity, and this is where the very first humanoids appear, including the modern Homo sapien, by the way. Okay, now it is very, very important to note that Africa was perhaps an understandable location for the birth of human beings due to the fact that this is a gigantic continent. Okay, it comprises about 22% of the Earth's landmass. Just to give you an idea, again. So we're talking about a very gigantic landmass, which today you can actually envision as a landmass that can actually include, for example, the United States, Western Europe, mainland China, for example, the subcontinent of India, and New Zealand, all in one, if you will. Imagine, so this is a very, very, again, extensive territory. And it is not just the extension of the territory, but the biodiversity, the climatic diversity, the ecological diversity, again, of Africa is also very extensive as well. Very, very extensive. It really, again, constitute many different kinds of climates, okay, of all kinds. It has plenty of water, of course, rivers, sources of this vital element that is vital, again, to actually for human beings. If human beings are to exist in this world, there must be water present where they actually settle, where they actually dwell, where they travel, and where they create a society or civilization. Again, so again, this is another part of the geography of Africa, is the availability of water. It has, once again, a wide array of different climates. For example, it has, of course, an extensive tropical rainforest here in what is called the west central coast, and of course the middle portion of Africa. Extensive tropical rainforest that is very, very dense and very rich in life. It has, of course, high precipitation throughout the year, and so this is a very productive, very fertile in terms of vegetation and wildlife, for example. And according to some scientists and geologists that have studied, of course, the Earth history, they indicate that the climate of Africa has varied across time, of course, and particularly the northern part of Africa, when is more desert-like, And this part of Africa extends almost from the northwestern to the northeastern section, and is just a vast desert. Again, that is just, mind-boggling, indeed, given the extent of the territory. But once upon a time, this region was actually forested. Okay, it was actually a tropical forest, as a matter of fact. So this tropical forest, this tropical rainforest extended up north, were very productive, plenty of rainfall, vegetation, and at some point there was a climatic change, of course, that occurred in the Earth history that changed the climate of North Africa, and pretty much, again, precipitation is very scarce now, and everything is just dried up. It becomes a desert, in other words. So again, the climates of the world have varied. They have changed from time to time. Okay? So, it had, at one point in time, a vast tropical rainforest, and that was, key for the production of life, not only wildlife, but also human beings trying to survive in the environment. It provided a very abundant stores of resources, medicinal, food, of all kinds, whether it's vegetation, whether it's animals, of course, and so on. Okay, we got also the Eastern African mountains, the mountainous regions, of course, and down to the south, we also look at a savanna, and there's plenty of wildlife there as well. And some desert regions in the south as well. Okay, so it is a very diverse continent, and understandably, this is going to be a continent that pretty much supplied everything that was necessary for the appearance of human beings. Okay, so this is the homeland, if you will, of humanity. And as I mentioned, this is not just concerning Africa, this is concerning world history or world civilizations, is that there has been constant climatic changes, environmental changes that occurred over certain cycles of time. So according to scientists, again, time moves in cycles, and the Earth is governed by those cycles, and that actually changes the constitution of certain regions ecologically, climatically, and so on. Again, the Saharan desert, again, is a case in point. Okay, it used to be once upon a time, again, a very, very abundant and rich forest, if you will. All right, so as I said, there is going to be the appearance, again, about 7 million years ago, of the very first humanoids in Africa. Meaning that human beings, at least what today we associate as a human being, really goes back into, again, about 7 million years ago in Africa, when we're going to see the appearance of the very first fossils that correspond to human-like creatures, if you will, that were so-called bipedal. Bipedal means that they walked in 2 feet, in other words. Okay, bipedal. As opposed to the apes, of course, that had existed around the world and in this region as well, that were fourpedal. They used their 4 limbs in order to walk and climb and etc. and fight and you name it. Very, very different. So there's going to be something new, a differentiation, in which we're going to see the very first blueprint of what a human being is going to look like much, much later, of course, around 7 million years ago. Now, how this happened? Okay? Well, we don't know. There is in science, what is commonly called a common ancestor theory, in that it is not really stated that human beings evolved from the apes necessarily. that somehow the apes transformed themselves into humans. That is not to say that that happened, but rather that there is a common ancestor that, that we're cousins, we're very closely related genetically, that we share a common ancestor, and we don't know what kind of common ancestor we share. This is called the missing link. The assumption is we share a common ancestor because of how close our genetics are, of course. There's a close connection. But what was that ancestor? We have no idea. No link, no fossil, no remnant, no skull, no skeleton has been found to determine what that ancestor is. Okay, so that's what it means, the missing link, in other words. So it's just a theory, again, that is based on genetics. Is mainly based on genetics, that there's a close association between humans and apes, but we just don't know what is our common ancestor, whether we share a common ancestor. We don't know. Now, having said that, the very first humanoid that appeared on the face of the earth was called this is a very difficult, term, by the way, to pronounce, Sahelanthropus. Let us just call it like that, okay? It's a very technical, of course, term. This is the first humanoid that appeared in Central Africa about 7 million years ago, and this is a reconstruction, of course, a digital reconstruction, taking, of course, the skull into consideration, the shape, the structure, and so on. This is a digital reconstruction of what that humanoid looked like. Again, it's bipedal. It walks into feet. So that's all that we know about this humanoid in terms of course, the remnants that we have found, which is just skulls, in other words. So this is the skulls and the skeleton that actually you can see that it walks into feet again, that it goes back 7 million years ago. So that's the first one. Much, much later, about 4.5 million years ago, we have found, of course, fossils from another humanoid. It's called the Adripithecus. And this is the second humanoid to appear in East Africa. Once again, it walks on 2 feet, so it's not considered necessarily the kind of four-pedal ape that was still present, and still is present today, by the way. That this is a different kind of, creature that we're talking about, a different kind of humanoid, and of 4.5 million years ago. Okay, and this is more or less, in a kind of reconstruction form, using digital, of course, technology and so on. This is more or less how they looked like, okay, back in the day, okay, back in that remote time, okay. Now, about 4 million years ago, there appeared another yet humanoid called the Australopithecus africanus. Okay, this is the third humanoid, and this is a yet more sophisticated, if you will, humanoid that is going to exhibit a larger brain. So far the first two that I mentioned had small brains, so to speak, compared now to the Australopithecus. So the brain is growing and expanding. Is mutating, in other words. So we see again this branch of humanoids about 4 million years ago. This is how that humanoid looked like, and at some point that Australopithecus, which was very, very, let us just say, still not very clearly differentiated again from the earlier humanoids, we're going to see about 2.5 million years ago a humanoid called Homo habilis. And Homo habilis means the handy human. Okay, this is the very first human that exhibit yet a larger brain and was able to start crafting tools. The very first tools ever crafted. The humanoids prior to the Homo habilis again did not craft tools. They use, of course, rocks as weapons and so on to hunt and fight. But the Homo habilis is now crafting tools, not very sophisticated. So we're not really expecting, very sophisticated tool technology, but is beginning to do so. It is beginning the process of crafting tools. Particularly, they will take, for example, certain rocks that were just simple tools. Once again, they will, grab a rock and try to shape it in the form of a knife, for example, or an axe, even though they still use their hand to strike the animal with it and so on. Nonetheless, it's already sharpened. You can see that they're molding, in other words, the elements. They're beginning again to mold the elements. Okay, that's the Homo habilis. Now, later on, about 1.9 million years ago, all the way to about 8,000 years ago, more or less, we're going to see the rise of another humanoid that is going to be far more sophisticated in many ways in their physical, for example, constitution. Their brain is going to be much akin to the brain of modern humans, and he's going to become known as Homo erectus. Homo erectus is also referred as by some scientists as the Neanderthals. In other words, the Neanderthals. This is the human being that is not only walking on 2 feet, but also in a very erect way, again, and their spine, in other words, like modern humans, that is to say. An ape that walks straight and is going to be the very first humanoid that is going to migrate out of Africa. Okay, this is how the Neanderthals look like. And give and take, this is, of course, a reconstruction based on cranial remains and so on, and so this is a reconstruction of that. They spread throughout Eurasia, meaning Europe and Asia, about 2 million years ago. Roughly speaking, 1.9 million or so. We're going to see the Neanderthals moving out of Africa and they're settling in Europe and Asia. They're going to be the ones that discovered fire. Okay, whether it was out of accident or not, we don't know, but they do discover fire, and that creates a change in history, a biological change in which they're able to step outside of the cave by using fire to defend themselves from animals. They're now exploring the world. They're exploring areas that were cold, that were uninhabitable for them, but now with fire they can inhabit colder regions. They're going to be cooking their food, so their digestive system is going to change. The stomachs are growing smaller, and their jaws as well, because they're cooking meat, and so on. So the discovery of fire brought biological change among the Homo erectus. Now they're going to be crafting more sophisticated tools and creating different kinds of weapons with them, axes and flints and so on, and knives that are still very crude in so many ways, but they're still, again, using a more advanced technology, the stone cutter, as it was called. Okay. Now, last but not least, what we're going to be looking at is the last human creature that appeared is the one that we actually represent and embody today, the Homo sapiens. Okay, this is the human species. The modern day human species is called the Homo sapiens. They appeared in East Africa. Okay, it is true that the Neanderthals stepped out of Africa starting around 2 million, 1.9 million years ago and so on. They inhabited Europe and Asia. But there's still going to be another species, the Homo sapiens, okay, that are going to appear in East Africa. And this is really East Africa, the homeland of Homo sapiens, about 200,000 years ago. So modern day human beings all over the world can trace our origins to the Homo sapiens that appeared in the continent of Africa about 200 years ago. Okay, and this is a reconstruction of Homo sapiens. Okay, Homo sapiens. There was variation in terms of skin color, for example. There was variation in the texture of their skin and hair and so on. But nonetheless, this is the same species. In other words, the modern day Homo sapiens. Okay. And the reason why this is stated by scientists is because of DNA testing. You know, there has been, of course, in recent times with the advent of genetics and modern technology, testings that have been done all over the world. You know, virtually every, ethnicity around the world from all over the continents, all the continents of the world, performing what is called a mitochondrial DNA testing. Okay, or it's called molecular genetics. And we're really trying to determine whether there is a direct relationship between all of human beings, and if we can trace our ancestor back in time to a common ancestor. And indeed, what the results have shown is that modern Homo sapiens in Africa, the males in this case, we all descend from a male ancestor that inhabited Africa about 100,000 years ago. In other words, when you look at human beings worldwide, all males, through their DNA testing, are related to one another through a common ancestor that inhabited Africa 100,000 years ago. You're testing the remains, the DNA of a certain Homo sapien that lived in this region about 100,000 years ago, and indeed there's a direct connection for all people, for all males living in the world. And women are also tested worldwide, and they're also all related to a woman that actually lived in Africa 200,000 years ago as well. So there's only one human species, and there's only one human race. This idea that there are many races around the world is really an artificial construction of the human species, because there's only one race. Genetically, it shows that all human beings, regardless of our skin color, our hair texture, and so on, all of those characteristics, we're all related to one another through a common ancestors that go, again, back to Africa around this time. Again, this is just, again, a kind of depiction of the different kinds of humanoids that have existed, again, in the world, particularly in Africa, the Australopithecus, the Homo habilis, the Homo erectus, the Neanderthal, and the modern Homo sapien. Okay, they have appeared in different points in time, and of course, the significance of this is that there has been migrations out of Africa. Homo sapiens that came from East Africa are going to step out of the continent to populate the world. Okay, they're going to step out of Africa through a process of ongoing migrations caused by climate change, by environmental change, for food scarcity that pushed them out of the continent, pursuing wild, game in different parts of the world, and they're going to inhabit the entire planet. As a matter of fact, they will become the Caucasian, for example, of the European continent that is now, of course, Caucasians are all over the world, of course, the Mongoloid of Asia, and including, of course, black, coming from Africa as well. Not to ignore, of course, the Native Americans as well. Native Americans are part of this Homo sapien, of course, species that came out of Africa and that have traveled around the world, starting around 200,000 years ago, migrating and settling and becoming the different peoples of the world, that is to say. So we're all connected, we're all part of the same human family, and we all have our origins back in Africa, the Homo sapiens. Now, what was really the transition from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens. In other words, we know that Neanderthals were the first ones to step out of Africa about 2 million years ago. I mentioned that, the Neanderthal that went into Europe and Asia. But much, much later, 200,000 years ago, we have the modern Homo sapiens stepping out of Africa and also migrating around the world. So how is it that the Neanderthal is going to disappear, and instead what we're going to see is now the Homo sapien becoming the dominant and really the only species, the only human species in the world? What happened to the Neanderthals? What happened to the Homo erectus, in other words, that had migrated out of Africa? There are three major theories that attempt to explain, what actually happened between the Homo erectus and the Homo sapiens, and what happened to the Neanderthals. One is the so-called the regional continuity model. What is the regional continuity model? Well, is that the Homo erectus, the Neanderthals, and the Homo sapiens continued, so to speak, on their own. They continued. It's not that the Neanderthals became extinct and suddenly the Homo sapiens, prevailed, as if the Homo sapiens pretty much eliminated the Neanderthals, but rather that they both continued and they became part of the different ethnicities of the world. Okay? The different ethnicities of the world. So what that means is that still everybody goes back to Africa, because whether you have a Neanderthal, background or Homo sapien, okay, they're both coming from Africa anyways. The second major theory is called the complete replacement theory. And that is that the Neanderthals became extinct, either because they were overwhelmed by Homo sapiens, or there was a war between them, in which the Neanderthals eventually lost. And so the Homo sapiens ended up, replacing completely the Neanderthals altogether. That is the second theory. And the partial replacement model, number 3, is that some scientists tend to believe that there was interbreeding. As a matter of fact, that there was, exchange, if you will, between the Neanderthals and the Homo sapiens. They mated, some of them, and there was a certain partial replacement because the Neanderthals began to take on more human characteristics, and eventually, there was a merge. And so this is a partial replacement. There's still a lot of people, according to this theory, that have Neanderthal actually genetic background, in other words. But the Homo sapiens are now the dominant, of course, species in the world. And it's called Homo sapiens because this is a species that developed the large brain with the neocortex. The neocortex, the frontal part of the brain, is the one responsible for analysis and reason. Explaining why things happen. Every time we observe something that happens, we're trying to reason and analyze that, of course. And that enables us to, create knowledge, to create language, for example, to create scientific ideas and tools, technologies. And so we are now called Homo sapiens. Sapiens means, to know, knowledge, those that inquire, sapiens, those that actually know and do, in other words. Okay, so this is, of course, just a survey, if you will, of the origins of the universe that we explore, the first Big Bang, if you will, how the universe sprang into existence with the Big Bang, the very first, energy that burst into existence. We looked at the formation of galaxies, solar systems, planets, and eventually the Earth. And at some point, we looked at the first biological Big Bang with the appearance of those simple cells billions of years ago. So we see that, again, as the first moment in which life is created. And we see, according to those theories, again, the theory of evolution is that the origins of species comes from that. a multiplicity of different life forms appear in the world. And eventually the mammals appeared about 60 million years ago. And eventually, of course, about 7 million years ago, human beings began to, at least humanoids, appear again in the world through the fossils that we just looked at. Eventually, they stepped out of Africa. I mean, the appearance of the first humanoids are in Africa. And out of Africa, we're going to see the massive spread of those humanoids, particularly the Neanderthals about 2 million years ago, and about 2,000 years ago, Homo sapiens. This is the end of session 1, and when we come back in part 2, we're going to look at the rise of the very early societies. Very early societies. We're not going to look at civilizations, at least the rise of civilizations, until session 3. But in part 2, we're now moving on in our timeline to look at how human beings are beginning to form their first cultures and societies. This is all I have for you. I'll see you in part 2. Thank you.